Hi, and welcome to this tutorial that describes the process of migrating your high-risk isolation policy to the Consolidated SWG policy in Cloud SWG. The Consolidated SWG policy integrates the web isolation layer logic of HRI into the threat protection layer in the Cloud SWG portal. For tenants that use HRI with certain policy configurations, Broadcom is initiating a migration to the Consolidated policy. These tenants must review their policy to ensure that it behaves as expected, and this tutorial is intended to help with this process. Here's what we'll be talking about in this tutorial: understanding how the existing rules will be affected, inspecting the changes after migration, making needed adjustments to migrated rules before activation, activating the policy, and confirming the policy behavior. To begin, let's look at some threat protection and web isolation policy rules that have been configured as an example to demonstrate the various changes that will occur due to the migration, especially to any rules that involve a verdict related to isolation. As you would expect, all the block unless isolated rules will be affected. Of course, all the rules with block unless isolated verdicts will be affected. This is because now that all isolation policies can be included in the threat protection layer, the block unless isolated verdict is no longer needed and so is unsupported as a verdict. After the migration, existing block unless isolated rules will be temporarily preserved, but they will either have to be converted to a block verdict after migration or perhaps even deleted, as we will see. Because the web isolation layer will no longer exist, all the rules in this layer, with both do not isolate and isolate verdicts, will be migrated to the threat protection layer. Also, the new consolidated policy will offer new visibility to isolation profiles. We'll see what happens to these rules and how that looks in the next section. Now, let's take a look at what has changed after Broadcom initiates the migration process. All the affected policies will now appear in a temporary inactive state. The temporary policy retains all the original policy logic, while the web isolation and threat protection layers are consolidated. Now, after the migration, we can see that there are pending changes in our tenant policy, as indicated by the teal asterisk. In the threat protection layer, we see a new isolation settings button. This is where we can enable or disable high-risk isolation. We can also see that many of the previous rules have been migrated to a temporary verdict of either block unless isolated or allow unless isolated. Both of these verdicts are no longer needed, as all isolation rules are in the same layer now, so these verdicts will need to be revised, as we will see a bit later on. Also, we now have 4 new rules, H1, H2, and H3, as part of the Threat Protection Group A, and H4 as part of the Group B. These rules have been migrated from the previous rules in the former web isolation layer. We'll go into more detail on these, but first let's look at the temporary web isolation layer that still exists until all temporary rules have been migrated. When you go to the web isolation layer now, you'll see the following message. The web isolation layer is now read-only. It is used for evaluating the verdict of the temporary rules with block unless isolated and allow unless isolated verdict in threat protection. Make sure to create appropriate rules in threat protection based on the supported verdicts. This layer will be removed completely once there are no temporary rules in your policy. So basically that's what this tutorial is intended to do, to assist you in creating the appropriate rules in threat protection so that you can feel confident in activating your policy. Previously, high-risk isolation was managed under the P1 rule, which was a very basic global rule that just specified that any risky website, such as websites that have risk levels 5 through 10, assessed as suspicious by the Global Intelligence Network, or simply labeled uncategorized, should be sent to isolation. Apart from this P1 rule, we see 2 other rules simply providing exemptions from isolation with do not isolate verdicts. None of this is in threat protection. In the new H1 rule, we can see that risk level 5 and 6, or uncategorized traffic, is being isolated, and we can also view the isolation profile. Now we can see that this profile indicates default isolation for the specified traffic. This is not editable, which is because this is only high-risk isolation, which is included as part of the Cloud SWG basic entitlement. Customers who want to customize an isolation behavior by editing profiles need to purchase the full web isolation subscription. Now, the exact behavior configured is preserved from before the migration. With the new consolidated policy, high-risk isolation customers can now see how your users are being isolated based on the destination. In this case, you can see that the users are not being prevented from any action on the isolated websites. And when they're isolated, they have a red indication bar. Now, moving to the H2 rule, we see that if users are browsing to websites with a risk level 7 or 8, they are isolated with a profile called HRI Profile Read Only. In this profile, we see that the users will access the websites in read-only mode. Users see a message that the website is potentially unsafe. However, the users are able to override this property. In addition, the users will not be able to enter sensitive data over an unsecured connection over HTTP. But again, users are allowed to override this. And as mentioned earlier, if you'd like to create your own isolation profiles or even to select which exact website should be sent to isolation and with a specific isolation profile, you'll need to upgrade your licensing and start using full web isolation. Next, with Rule H3, you can also see that we are not really isolating risk level 9 and 10. This is because we know, as part of our risk level analysis, that websites that get these classifications should be blocked. There's no excuse for users to browse to these websites. So these are the H1, H2, and H3 rules. We've seen now that the P1 rule was divided into 3 different rules in the Group A of threat protection. And as part of the migration, we'll find it useful to change the position of these rules in the layer, but we'll do that a bit later on. Another rule that's introduced is the H4 in Group B, which is explicitly for document isolation, which specifies that instead of the user downloading the file directly, the files will be viewed similarly to a website that is isolated. That allows the user to view the contents of the file without having to actually download and store the file. This prevents any malicious download that tries to exploit a vulnerability in Microsoft Office or Acrobat Reader and so on from being executed on the end user's device. So as you can see here, any isolated website, if the user tries to download any of the supported file types, the document will be isolated. Here you can see how the isolation is carried out. We can see that we are not restricting the users from any of the supported actions, meaning that users will still be able to download the original file, will still be able to download the file as a converted PDF version. They'll be able to print the file, and they'll be able to copy contents from the file. So now we've seen how the new high-risk isolation logic is being introduced into the threat protection layer. And remember the message we saw in the temporary web isolation layer? We're now at the place where we need to make whatever changes are needed so that the appropriate rules based on supported verdicts are ready to be activated. The first step we'll take is to take a look at the migrated policy and handle any isolation exemptions. You can see the isolation exemptions here with their allow verdicts just above the new isolation rules. These are now disabled, as you can tell, because they are grayed out. The reason is because we do not want to automatically allow this traffic. Customers should evaluate whether these rules are still needed and whether that does not bypass any relevant rule you may have, and make sure that it fits your overall policies. In this example, there are no conflicts, so we'll start by simply enabling those rules. Next, we need to see whether any of the rules that have been migrated from the web isolation layer are redundant with pre-existing rules in the threat protection layer. In this case, we can see that rule number 9 has the same destination, example.com, as number 12. We notice that rule 9, which was a pre-existing rule in threat protection, has a verdict of block unless isolated, which we know now is an unsupported verdict. So this rule's original condition was that if there are no rules anywhere else that isolate this destination, it should be blocked. And we see in rule 12, which has been migrated from the web isolation layer, the original verdict was do not isolate, a verdict that is by default assigned an allow verdict as part of the migration. However, because of rule 9, we can tell that if it's not isolated, it should be blocked. So we'll keep rule 9 and in a subsequent step change the verdict to block, and we can delete rule 12. And for rule 9, we can convert the temporary block unless isolated verdict to block. Now, let's take this opportunity to discuss how the previous conditions of the rules are preserved. This warning says that we are temporarily preserving the behavior of the two layers only while the migration is still in effect. The read-only web isolation layer we saw earlier is being used for evaluating these temporary rules. So a verdict of block unless isolated means that it checks the read-only isolation layer to see whether this destination was isolated or not. And because we have just seen that this rule has the temporary block unless isolated verdict, and we know that there are no other rules with an isolated verdict for this traffic, then we can just convert this verdict to block. Now, if for some reason we still wanted to preserve the logic of the block unless isolated verdict, we could move this rule beneath the H1 through H3 rules so that the isolation decision would be made before the block verdict. So what we can see here is that we have the typical sort of rules that any Cloud Swig tenant has, with a condition that says if the traffic is not being isolated, let's block it. But we know that this is being isolated, as we have seen in the H1 through H3 rules. Therefore, we can just delete these rules. Now, for the last block unless isolated rule we have, again, we're not sure whether the traffic will be isolated or not. What we'll do here is to convert this to block, but instead of leaving it in its existing position, we'll move it below the risk isolation rules. Now, if the traffic matches this criteria, and it's not isolated by the above conditions, then it'll be blocked. Now, finally, we have the allow unless isolated rules. Allow unless isolated means basically that if traffic is isolated by the web isolation layer, it will be isolated, and if not, it will be just fully allowed. And when we're migrating these rules of destination, we need to understand our intention when we created the original allow unless isolated condition. Did we just want to stop the traffic from being blocked by related threat protection rules, and instead we wanted the traffic to be isolated later on by the web isolation layer? Or do we want to truly bypass the traffic? In our scenario, let's assume we intended that this paste bin destination, which by the way has a risk level of 5, to be isolated, and the only reason why we created an allow unless isolated rule here was to make sure that it would not be blocked by any subsequent rules. The solution is to make sure that isolation happens before this rule might get blocked by any subsequent rule. The way we do that is to move all of our isolation rules together as a batch to be ahead of that pastebin rule. So in this case, we're moving the block unless isolated P kind of rules, which are now the block rules, as well as the new isolation rules, and also the exemptions, and moving them to the top. So now that we know this traffic pastebin will be isolated, because as we said, it's risk level 5, which maxes the H1 rule, we can simply delete this rule. For the second allow unless isolated rule, our intention was to make sure that this traffic should be fully allowed from threat protection. We weren't concerned about any isolation rules, so we can just convert this to allow. And now we're finished adjusting all our rules. Before activating, be sure you're ready, because once you click activate, you cannot recover the previous state. After activation, besides your migrated policies, you'll now have much more visibility into isolated sessions in the web isolation proxy logs, which provide critical insights into network activity, security, and compliance. The final step is to confirm that the consolidated policy works as intended. It's recommended to have a group of testers try the destinations that are blocked, allowed, and isolated as per the policy. Also check log traffic, web isolation log, and web isolation reports. And finally, check the policy again to troubleshoot any unexpected behavior, and repeat previous steps as needed. This concludes this tutorial. Thanks for watching.